don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. Hello again, and thanks so much for tuning in. I do appreciate it. Just a reminder that our PBL Summer Conference, which is titled PBL Grow 24, is open for registration, and you can find that at wegrowteachers.com, and you'll see it along the top menu there. This is our 5th time offering this, and it'll be in our home base of Louisville, Kentucky in June, and we'd love to have you attend if you're interested in learning more about how to implement and design project-based learning. We also have a couple of online courses available now, one which is PBL On Demand and another called Creating a Culture of Inquiry. Those are on sale for a limited time only at a deeply discounted price, so please go to, again, wegrowteachers.com, and you'll see online courses along the top menu, and you can find them there. As always, all of our professional development offerings are at wegrowteachers.com, and I'd encourage you to visit that and check out all of our blog pieces that you can learn from and share if you are so inclined. In addition to our main website, we of course have our Thought Stretchers education community, which you can find at thoughtstretchers.org. This is meant to be a place where you can have conversations that are more intellectually nourishing and less toxic and polarized. We have lots of events that we are offering throughout the spring, and you can find those in the events tab. So please jump on over to thoughtstretchers.org and create an account and sign in if you are already a member, and join us for those conversations. As always, you can reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org with any comments, questions, or concerns. In this episode, I spoke with teacher, researcher, and writer Dylan Wiliam. Most of our conversations centered around the dogmatism and differences between the two sides of the spectrum of direct and explicit instruction and science of learning versus sort of inquiry and constructivist kinds of education. So we spent lots of time talking about some of the various ways in which that tension shows up, and formative assessment, and the importance of different outcomes, and how to gear and align our teaching approaches to those. Dylan's been around education in a lot of different ways and shapes and forms, and it was interesting to get his perspective, and I appreciate the conversation, and as always, I hope it's helpful. And here is that conversation with Dylan. All right, I am with Dylan Wiliam, who has given us some of his time. Looking forward to talking with him about education and research. But before we get going into that, Dylan, why don't you give our listeners who may be a little bit less familiar with you than some education crowds a little bit of background on who you are and sort of what you do, and maybe anything you think is relevant before we get into the meat of the conversation.
Thanks, Drew. Yes, well, I was born in North Wales. I spoke only Welsh until I was about 10. My parents moved to Cardiff, and I went to elementary school, and I did all my studies through the medium of Welsh. But my parents figured that I needed probably to learn English in order to go to a secondary school, because there wasn't a Welsh language secondary school within traveling distance. So I learned to speak English around the age of 10, 11. So I am an EAL, English as an additional language learner. I grew up then in Manchester, and then moved to London when I was completed with my undergraduate studies. I was a high school teacher, middle school teacher for about 8 years. Got sucked into a research project and worked on that for about 3-4 years, and then got a faculty appointment at a University of London. And so I kind of worked my way up through the ranks, ended up being the Dean of the School of Education there at King's College London. I was then headhunted to join Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey, as Senior Research Director. So I did 3 years there. Then went back as a Provost of a university in London, and did 4 years of that, and decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my working life being nice to people with money and fundraising, so I quit. So I was a tenured academic who just basically gave it all up and became self-financing. So that's what I've been doing for the last 12, 13 years, is I'm a self-financing academic. So I do talks in order to get some cash, and I spend the rest of the time doing the things that I want to do.
There you go. Well, I'm curious about lots of things, but the time with the educational testing service, what was that like? Because that seems like a job that I would not, or a gig that I would not want to do.
So I was attracted to it because they were aware of the need to move away from their core business. I don't know if you know this, but the Educational Testing Service write and administer the SAT, but it belongs to the College Board.
Mm-hmm.
So that's their main product. They have other tests like TOEFL. I think they lost GMAT. So I think that in the early 2000s, they realized that they should diversify. And so they'd heard about this thing called formative assessment, and they'd heard about these two guys, Black and William, who were doing some pretty innovative work in that field. They looked at Black was 74 and William was 47, so they thought, we'll have William. So I went to ETS in order to basically help them broaden their portfolio, to look away from testing for predicting student success in college and more towards assessment that actually improved instruction. So I spent 3 years there doing what I could. I built some products for them. But the interesting thing was that ETS realized that if you build something that's of value to school districts, you have to sell it to school districts.
Mm-hmm.
ETS had one major client, College Board, for most of its existence. It had some state testing contracts, but it didn't have anything resembling a sales force that could sell these professional development products to 13,000 school districts. So they basically sold off the product that I and my colleagues built there. That work came to an end. They were really focusing on going back to their core mission because they discovered that they could actually survive in that arena. They weren't in the business of selling anything to school districts. And so, I set up a learning and teaching research center there, and I think that's still going on. I think it's quite interesting. But in a way, ETS has gone back to its old business of rigorous psychometric testing, primarily focused on predicting student success in the future, less so on supporting instruction.
Yeah, that's how I think of them. That's nothing about formative assessment does resonates with me when I think of ETS. You said they sold off the product. Is it still in operation? Do you know what it's called?
Well, it was called Keeping Learning on Track, and it was licensed to NWA, Northwest Evaluation Association. They tried marketing it, but in a way, they actually, I don't think they marketed it in the right way. So my idea was to develop a program that would be scalable because it wouldn't require any external facilitation. So I wanted to build something that you could just give to schools. Of course, it's going to be better if you have support in implementing it. But I thought that should be an optional extra. What I wanted to do was just to put resources in the hands of building leaders, actually. Just principals and vice principals in schools, and give them the resources they would need to lead effective teacher learning in their buildings. And I discovered that very few American businesses want to do that. They want continuing repeat sales. They want to sell you the same test over and over again. And so the whole thing basically didn't work because there was no interest in the business model because it wasn't going to raise enough money, enough revenue for the vendor.
Gotcha. Well, that's all very interesting, but probably better for a different kind of podcast than the one we're doing here. One of the things that I have really been trying to dive into and unpack and get more complex and nuanced conversations about is maybe I would characterize it as sort of a spectrum of teaching and learning, and thinking about the what I would say is a false dichotomy and false binary between sort of the science of learning, direct and explicit instruction crowd versus inquiry, constructivist, progressive, that kind of thing. And I see it as a spectrum and less a binary, but not everybody does. And I'm curious if I'm understanding correctly from what I've heard and read about your work, is that you've made a progression over the years from maybe one end of the spectrum to the other a bit. And I don't know if I'm characterizing that accurately. I'd like to have you actually kind of describe that, if that's the case, or where you might how you might describe your sort of journey of thinking about learning and teaching and those kinds of things.
So I definitely, in my early career, math was my major. Mm-hmm. I actually continued to do math for interest's sake. So I actually did recreational math regularly. I still like doing math problem solving on Sunday afternoons.
Recreational math might be an oxymoron to many.
Exactly, but it's just so fascinating. Just those kinds of puzzles that come up in math, like which numbers can you express as the sum of two squares? Just a really rich puzzle. So I taught that way. I thought that problem solving was the best way to teach kids to solve problems. And I had reasonable success with that. I mean, my results were reasonable. Some students did really well. Some students did less well. I used quite innovative approaches, including personalization and instruction. So most of my teaching, I used individualized learning. So each of the 35 students in the class would be working on an individual program of work. And some of the activities would be collaborative, but some of them would be individual. And it was, it worked well. I then became an academic. I started doing some research projects around children's logical thinking, where my work was really interviewing students one-to-one, trying to explore their logical thinking. And only really in the last, I suppose, 10 years did I get back into the cognitive psychology of what people call the science of learning now. And I came across this work on what's called cognitive load theory, mm-hmm. proposed by John Swallow back in the late 1980s. And I rejected it because I didn't want it to be true. I wanted to believe that the best way to get students to solve problems was to have them solve problems. And so I didn't want cognitive load theory to be true. First of all, because it just didn't fit with my view of the best way to teach, but also because I didn't want it to be true that I was making things worse for some of my students by teaching in a way that didn't work for them. But as I engaged with the research, I became more and more convinced that there was something really important here. And I'm now convinced, and I tweeted about this in 2017. I said that I'd come to the conclusion that cognitive load theory was the single most important thing for teachers to know. And I got a lot of pushback, and people said, well, I think there's more important stuff. And I said, fine, but that's my opinion because it's powerful, it's important, and it's deeply counterintuitive. But the thing that really impressed me was it explained something that I had observed as a teacher, that every teacher I've ever spoken to has observed, and yet never explained. How can it be that you teach this wonderful lesson, you check for understanding at the end of the lesson, and every student gets it, they understand exactly what you've been teaching, and 3 weeks later, you check on the understanding again, and it's as if the men in black have come along with their neuralizers and erased every single trace of that lesson. And that's what really did it for me, that idea that this explains why students can be successful in completing a task in the class, but not learn what the task is designed to teach them. And yet it's something that every teacher has experienced, and teachers see this all the time. Two kids in the same class, both paying attention, both trying their best. 2 weeks later, one remembers everything, the other one remembers almost nothing. And the crucial thing there is working memory. And the fact is, it took me a long time to admit this, the fact is, my way of teaching using problem solving was making things harder for the students with less working memory. It worked great for students with lots of working memory. And I think this also addresses the issue of inquiry versus explicit instruction. Turns out that inquiry-based instruction, problem solving, is much more effective for students with high working memory and students with a relative degree of expertise in the subject. But for lower achieving students, students with more limited working memory, step-by-step instruction is generally more effective. And I think this explains why we get so many variable results when we look at these. People say, this experiment shows that inquiry-based instruction works. This experiment shows that direct instruction works. The fact is, there's what we used to call in the 1980s aptitude treatment interaction. Some things work better for some students, other things work better for other students. So I would characterize my personal shift as being a shift towards the center rather than to the other extreme, in that I think inquiry can be important and useful, but I think we've neglected for too long what cognitive science has to teach us about how to make our teaching more memorable, how to get what we're teaching to stick.
Yeah, so there's several threads there that I think are really useful and interesting, or at least I hope will be. And I would agree with you, and I would say I'm sort of more in the center and probably have shifted over the years in my conversations with folks like Paul Kirchner and others. We do a lot of professional development work on project-based learning and talk about our work as being through the lens of inquiry and really value that. But I also, when we work with schools and when we work with educators, you say, well, one of the criticisms of sort of, you can conflate and flatten all of this, but PBL or inquiry or constructivist or progressive education is that we don't value knowledge. We're not teaching. We're thinking we're not supposed to do any direct teaching or explicit teaching, and that is, I think, a valid criticism that we should take on. And one of the things that we try to express to teachers, and sometimes they will say, wait, we're supposed to give students autonomy. That means we are supposed to turn that knob up to 11, right? And I said, no, it's dependent upon that student, what the cognitive complexity of that task is, what their academic achievement is coming into it, and then you figure out how you're going to, what levels of guidance you would include in that instruction. So that is something that I've sort of shifted and in our messaging, because I do think that's a valid criticism. And I talked with Ard Lazander and the idea of combining direct instruction and inquiry. And one of the frustrations that I see, I'm curious how you think about this, is the conflation or the mischaracterization of inquiry teaching. I'm curious how you would define it, but that I see from lots of the research paper, the Sweller and Kirchner talk about it as discovery learning. And while there's certainly such a thing as discovery learning, it's not equivocal. It's not the same exact thing as what we're talking about along the sort of spectrum of inquiry teaching. So I'm curious how you think about that piece of it and how you would define inquiry teaching.
Well, I think we lack adequate definitions of these terms, which is why the conversation often goes, different people talk past each other. So Paul and his colleagues wrote a paper about why minimally guided instruction doesn't work.
Yep.
So the point is, it does work for some students. And this is why doing education research is so messy, because some students will explore these situations and get a lot out of it. When we contrast PBL with direct instruction, one of the things that I think we haven't really got to the bottom of is what's the problem here? Because what's the project? It turns out that the design of the task that you give the students has a huge impact on how productive their exploration is. And so some students can actually, one task, they explore and they learn a lot. They get to the point where you want to get, let me give you an example. I taught science. I remember giving some high schoolers this task. The school building was 8 floors. It was rectangular. And I asked them to estimate the heating requirements of the building. And so it was a completely open-ended problem, but I designed it in a particular way that there were 20 points for the solution, but every time they asked me for a piece of information, it would cost them 1 point. And everybody in the group had to agree to ask for that piece of information before they could actually ask me. The reason I designed that task in that way was because the thing that I think they wouldn't know in the days before the internet, they would need to know how much energy would be needed to increase the temperature of 1 cubic meter of air by 1 degree Celsius. So in other words, I designed this task to practically force them to invent for themselves the concept of specific heat capacity. And so I think some sort of problems like that, because of their design, can be very productive in pushing students towards thinking about certain sorts of things. And other problems that look very similar often have the students just flailing around and just not getting anywhere. The other thing that I think is important is efficiency. So I'm very happy to stipulate that things that students discover for themselves are going to be better remembered than things they get told. The problem is some of our students don't have time. They don't have time to discover this stuff for themselves. They would be better off if they were given more formal step-by-step instruction. But where the whole argument, I think, runs into the sand is, and where I've changed my mind quite radically over the last 5 years, is that at the end of the day, we can't teach them enough to last them the rest of their lives. We need our students to leave us at the age of 18 with a passion for learning, with that curiosity and inquisitiveness that they arrived when they were 6.
Mm-hmm.
And so what worries me about this big push towards direct instruction is sometimes it's just not exciting for the students. It just kills the curiosity. And therefore, they may actually learn a lot, but they leave high school with the desire for knowledge extinguished.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem because most of what they need for the rest of their lives hasn't been discovered or invented yet.
Right.
So for me, just nurturing that curiosity through things like problem-based learning, through project-based learning is essential. But as you said, we also need to teach them the concepts and the skills and the facts, because they don't need more practice in thinking. They need more things to think with.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is particularly true in science and math. The idea is that science is mostly model-based reasoning. Mm-hmm. And you could discover the models for yourself, but it's usually more efficient to actually have somebody explain the model for you and then have you explore how you can apply that in different situations, leading to transferability, so that that knowledge acquired in a classroom is available to the students when they actually tackle real world problems.
Yeah. And I've had extended, I guess arguments is maybe a best way. I try not to argue. I'm trying to understand and share understanding and all of that. But one of the things that I think is really valuable about project-based learning and inquiry-based learning is, if it's done well, is that it's scaffolded and structured in a way that does include significant amounts of direct and explicit instruction. And I'd like to actually dive into, because those are two different things, and we're using them interchangeably, and they're not the same thing.
Right.
But just shorthand, direct instruction, right? That teacher actually sharing knowledge and practicing and getting that long-term memory, or at least short-term memory, getting that knowledge into the bank so you can use it and lessen that cognitive load. But then it gives you an opportunity to get to some of the other pieces, to get to the sort of deep and transfer. If you want to use that surface deep and transfer framework, there are other ways to express it. And while I do think that it makes a lot of sense that we're having students leave our K-12 system, or matriculating into higher education with significant stores and banks of knowledge, and there's a real great argument for the sort of shared knowledge of E.D. Hirsch's argument and cultural kinds of things. We can argue about what that is and how much of it is important, but the reality, as I see it, is that knowledge is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so when those students matriculate into adult life, they are going to face challenges where they are going to need to solve and problem solve. And in my estimation, the ability to ask the right questions and frame things with questions and inquiry is integral in that. And they're not likely to have some teacher providing them direct instruction on how to buy a house, or whatever challenge in life it might be. So we've got to give them opportunities, in addition to some of the things you mentioned, we've got to give them opportunities to practice and to have it modeled for them how to to frame things in questions. And you mentioned need to know. That's one of the things, the integral pieces of project-based learning, as we say it, a really good driving question, then say, what are the things we need to know and learn about in order to do that, which then is your roadmap to get to what we're going to teach, and direct instruction might be a part of that and all of that. But the teacher in the planning phase says, these are the things I want them to think about and learn about. How do I pull those out and help them see those as need to know questions, model that, practice it? Sometimes they need significant challenge, practice at it to get better at it, but developing that skill. And when we're not doing that and we're just focusing solely on that direct instruction, that knowledge building, the opportunity cost, I think, is pretty large that will surface later in adult life, I guess.
But what makes it even more complicated is, of course, that we tend to assume that motivation causes achievement, but recent research has shown that achievement causes motivation at least as much. So I think we have to make sure that students experience success, and that's very often achieved through step-by-step instruction. I think it's also important to understand what we mean by direct instruction, because some people think of teachers standing at the front of the class and droning on, and that's not that's exactly not what Siegfried Engelmann proposed.
That's a straw man version of it.
Yeah. So what's really interesting to most people is to discover that direct instruction requires intensive use of classroom formative assessment. You teach in a way that heads off misconceptions, and then so let me give you a silly example. What's the definition of a prime number? Okay, so typically you ask a middle school teacher in the US and they'll say it's a number that can be divided by 1 and itself. And that's it, yeah? That's a bad definition because it leaves unresolved the issue whether 1 is a prime number. 1 can be divided by 1, yes. Can it be divided by itself? Yes. So that would make 1 a prime number. Actually, mathematicians don't want 1 to be a prime number because they want to preserve the fundamental theorem of arithmetic. So they define 1 not to be a prime number. 2 is the smallest prime. So the better teacher then defines a prime number as a number with exactly 2 factors. So 1 is not prime because it doesn't have enough factors. 6 isn't prime because it has too many factors. So just getting the definitions right that avoid students forming these misconceptions is an essential part of effective instruction. Then checking for understanding and review. And so the thing is that direct instruction looks a lot less like chalk and talk, if you like, than most people imagine. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, that we need to actually have better descriptions of the kinds of pedagogical approaches we're talking about in order to have these discussions.
How do you make the distinction, or how do you define direct and or explicit instruction?
Well, I don't use the term explicit instruction because I haven't found it, because it just requires too much definition to actually get. So I talk about direct instruction, and I talk about the things I've already mentioned: careful explanation that is designed to head off misconceptions, frequent checks for understanding, and regular review to provide retrieval practice, ideally interspersed with interleaved practice and distributed practice, doing things over lots of different study sessions. That would be the thing I would suggest. And that only works if what you're trying to do is what David Geary calls biologically secondary knowledge. So none of this stuff is useful for biologically primary knowledge, which is the stuff that humans are basically evolved to learn. So for example, young babies exposed to language learn to speak and hear and listen. And it can't be taught. It's not innate, because if you don't hear the language, you won't learn to speak and listen. But in the right rich environment, that capability develops. And in fact, transfer looks like it's biologically primary. It's something that even crows can do. So the best way to develop transfer is not explicit instruction of any kind, not direct instruction. It's giving students rich areas to explore and figure out what this new idea means in a different context. So play, for example, is essential when what you're focusing on is what David Geary calls biologically primary, the stuff that we are evolved to do: speaking, listening, recognizing faces, problem solving, general problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
Play is really important for that. But if you want students to learn how to solve quadratic equations, then formal step-by-step methods are more effective for most students. People always say that reading is biologically secondary. It has to be taught step by step. Well, actually, it's not true. About 25%, according to Robert Pianta's estimates at the University of Virginia, about 25% of students just get reading, no matter how bad the instruction they receive is. So it's really messy. But I think for me, the important thing is, in my conversation with teachers, is what kind of thing is this that you want your students to get better at? Is it something that benefits from step-by-step instruction, or is it something that is actually more likely to be well developed by exploration and play? And once you are clear about what kind of thing it is, then you can design your instruction.
Hattie, I think, might term that teaching with intent, and it gets at one of the things that I think is what I keep coming back to. And I had some back and forth with somebody, I won't mention his name, but somebody on the Twitter X, and is recently blocked because one of the things that I find is that there's sort of an evangelism that we see this with partisan politics. We see it everywhere. It's tribalism, right? It's us versus them. It's like this evangelism and just this us versus them mindset and mentality. And this person is a direct instruction advocate, evangelist, I would say. And I agree. Like, this is an efficient way to do instruction. If we're saying that learning is a change in long-term memory, then that is the evidence shows that's the most efficient. But in my estimation, learning is not solely that. There are other ways to think about and define learning. And so if we think about what are the outcomes we want, then it may be that something besides direct instruction might be the best way to go about teaching. And so your outcomes are what are designing, just in the same way formative assessment informs our instruction. We want to make sure that if we want students to struggle a little bit and to wrestle with some things that might not be efficient, inquiry could very well be the way you would go, even if it's not the most efficient. And that was cause for it was like I had said a heresy, and it was unhearable. And I don't know how to get past that. I don't know that you have an answer for that. I'm just, it's like we have to have more than just that as an outcome.
Right. So I think the trouble starts when people hear that phrase, learning is a change in long-term memory. Because when people who haven't been brought up as psychologists hear that, they assume it means memorization of facts and procedures. To a psychologist, long-term memory is where you store everything that you don't need to relearn how to do. So if you can ride a bicycle, it is in long-term memory. And the point of that definition from Paul Kirshner and his colleagues is to point out that if we undertake an instructional task with our students and they can do it by the end of today's lesson, but they can't do it 3 weeks later, we shouldn't call that learning.
Right.
We should reserve the word learning for a relatively long-term change in capability. Whether it's riding a bicycle, being able to shoot from the three-point line, the important point is it's about doing that for the long term. And a lot of unproductive discussion occurs because of this thing about long-term memory, where some people assume it's just facts and procedures, and other people have a much richer notion of that.
Yeah.
But in terms of how we get the debate progressing, I think it comes down to what he's trying to achieve. And so, for a start, there's a famous finding from the 2015 round of PISA, where they found that when they focused on science in that round, that science achievement was lower in classrooms with more project-based problem-based learning and project-based learning, more inquiry-based approaches to teaching science. And of course, some people have said, well, that shows that project-based learning, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning doesn't work in science. But it could be that in classrooms full of poorly motivated students, students who can't see the purpose of science, a teacher might choose to use more inquiry-based approaches in order to get the students more excited. So sometimes you have to, these situations are social situations, and they're very messy. So anybody who's adopting these hardline positions, in my view, don't understand the complexity of classrooms. And anybody who's dogmatic about these positions isn't, in my view, using an evidence-based approach, because the evidence does not support such hardline conclusions.
Yeah, well, you're preaching to the choir on that, and I would say the same thing as an inquiry advocate, that anybody who, and I am quite critical of those folks who, deeper learning, whatever terms they're using, and say, but are you teaching? Are the kids learning things? And if you want to do discovery learning, and if that matches your desired outcomes, then fine, so be it. But if it is that you have students that need to be doing well on accountability tests or things like that, that's probably not the best way to go. And let's be real about this and have that conversation in a way that makes more sense. One of the things that strikes me, I'm curious, and you're a math guy, is that a lot of that evangelism and sort of dogmatism and the science of learning seems to be connected to, at least loosely, to the kinds of learnings of like math and science. And I was a social studies teacher, so humanities and social studies, which tends to be more open-ended, which is different from an ill-defined problem.
Right.
Open-endedness is different. And so to me, it makes a lot more sense to employ inquiry in some of those spaces. Not that math and science doesn't have open-endedness or can't be viewed and taught through that lens, but we have hard facts, right? 2 + 2 = 4, and we want to make sure students know that. And I'm curious if you've seen that, if there's sort of a more tendency for dogmatic kind of approaches on that sort of science and learning and those kinds of things from the hard sciences versus more humanities and social studies, that kind of thing.
I think in my view, there's definitely that continuum of perspectives, and math and science are definitely towards one end. There's a very interesting classification of curriculum approaches by a guy called Perry many years ago, and some students are drawn to math and science because of the closure. There's always a right answer.
Right.
Some students don't like the fact that in history there isn't a right answer. There are stronger or weaker arguments, but the point is you can always come up with a different approach. And my favorite example of that is Gar Alperowitz's book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. People tend to think of the decision to use the atomic bomb as the closing act of World War II. He produces extensive documentary evidence to show that it was actually the opening act of the Cold War. So the whole idea of just turning an argument on its head like that can happen in social studies and history. Even more open-ended is English literature, where what matters is that you can see a variety of different readings of a text, for example, and there's even less kind of definitive, this is the right way to think about this text. And certainly in many systems that I've seen, the idea that a student should come up with at least 2 different interpretations of a text is seen as a particularly strong approach to literary criticism. So I think there's no doubt there's that continuum. But I think the other thing you said is also really important, which is that each subject has a canonical core and a much more open-ended aspect. So in math, yes, there's only one solution to a quadratic equation, but I also want students to be able to explore things like investigate the mathematics of a chessboard. The idea of not just being able to solve problems, but being able to define fruitful problems. What makes a good problem? What's a good thing to spend your time inquiring on? In the same way in science, there's you can balance chemical equations and there's a right answer and a wrong answer. But then when you've got the use of genetically modified organisms in food for humans, you've got a much broader range, and sadly, most of the debate is not very well informed by the science. But I think there's a kind of much more open-ended approach. There's no closure there, but there's also some facts that we might agree are important to move forward. So I think seeing that every subject has both of these aspects. There's a right way to spell a word, And so English also has this definitive character. This is correctly punctuated, this is incorrectly punctuated. And I think what's different is that there are more things that are up for grabs in social studies and English than there are in math and science, but that all school subjects have both of these elements in there.
Yeah. Well, again, and I want to move past the sort of binary and the dogmatic stuff, but what really does strike me is that both sides, if we're, at both ends of the spectrum, have engaged in, it strikes me as really funny that the inquiry advocates, progressive educators, often say things that are implying that direct and explicit instruction are hegemonic in our schools.
Right.
And direct and explicit instruction advocates and evangelists say inquiry and that is hegemonic in our schools. And it's like, well, both can't be true. We've got to understand that we've got to deal with reality here. And it frustrates me to see the more progressive end really badmouth the idea of doing actual teaching and that knowledge is important, that kind of thing. And also frustrates me to see the folks who are advocates of direct instruction and science of learning sort of advocates act like inquiry, and really, like in my estimation, they say it's it's really bad for kids. Like we've got to do all this, and they're missing some of that complexity and nuance. And so, if we land somewhere in the middle, which I don't even like that characterization, but for shorthand, it makes some sense, right? So, one of those things is how do we decide when to use what and when to use the other? And of course, formative assessment is a big piece of that. I know that's something that you talk and work a lot with. So understanding, and if we're talking about, some students may have prior academic achievement that allows them to be, they have their cognitive load is not going to be as heavy with a certain set of knowledge. I might call that they have that prior academic achievement, but they also may have a higher processor speed. May not, may or may not. How does a teacher, in your estimation, make that decision in the intentional planning pieces, but then in the intuitive moments where it's, a moment by moment sort of decision, if that makes sense?
It does. And I think what people aren't willing to acknowledge is that ultimately this is a moral choice that teachers have to make about the value you place on different students. So some teachers will say, I have to go through the content because I want to make sure that the highest achievers get to the highest possible level. So they do this kind of one-shot deal. You just get one chance to understand it. This is the kind of thing that Benjamin Bloom criticized in his work on mastery learning and mastery teaching. Basically, some kids need more shots at the learning to get the learning. He pointed out that if you're getting a bell curve, a normal distribution of achievement, you're not doing your job properly. Our job as teachers is not to reproduce what nature gives us, the fact that some kids find learning easy and some kids find learning harder. Our job is to make sure that all our students leave us ready to be productive and flourishing citizens.
Right.
But so the fact is that mastery learning, giving students a second shot at the learning, actually slows the group down. You're taking time when you could be pushing the highest achievers even further to make sure that everybody gets it. And people aren't willing to acknowledge there's a moral dimension, and teachers have to make those decisions. Bob Marzano has shown that there's way too much content to teach. His group estimated that the typical state standards have about 18 months worth of content, and you've got a year to teach it.
Yeah.
So what do you do? And the answer is you can either skim across the surface, cover every bit of content, and only the fastest kids get it, or you can go a bit more slowly and take more of the students with you. And that's a moral choice. And it's a moral choice that's also influenced by the context you're working in. So some teachers are in districts that have pacing guides for reasons I entirely understand, because you don't want students to fall too far behind. But the teachers say, I can't do anything with the kids who aren't getting it. So I think we have to understand that you can't actually come up with an answer of this independent of the moral choices we make about who we value in classrooms. And I think my view has shifted. I used to run classes for gifted students in math. I'm now much more concerned about the other end of the distribution, because success for them will make more of a difference to their lives. And that's a shift that I no longer accept this idea of talent as being something that's fixed and innate. For me, it's just how much time and support do students need to get this.
Well, I was listening to the podcast that you did with, if I get her last name right, Anna Stocky, and I think Chalk and Talk is the name of it. It's funny that you mentioned that earlier. And one of the things I think you said was good teachers lay foundations for learning that aren't realized for years to come. And that resonated with me. And I don't know if you meant it in the same way that it resonates with me. So I'm curious about this. Okay. So one of the things that I have had, dispute about with, sort of science and learning people is like that, the idea that things are measurable and those are the things we should be, aiming for as outcomes. And the direct and explicit instruction, those outcomes are generally very measurable. And again, I want to make sure that these are important, right? I'm not saying that's bad, that we shouldn't do those things. But one of the things that we should also be keeping an eye on are things that are not as easily quantifiable. They're more qualitative. And I don't know, maybe there's research on this, but it seems to me to be intuitively true, which of course the science learning people will lose their minds over, that you've got to have this paper that's well done and well designed and all of that. But that we want to cultivate skills and virtues and thinking in students, using knowledge, using the things that may not be easily measurable or even something that you'd notice in a student in the short term. You might notice little bits of it, but that as they mature, as they develop, as they gain more wisdom, as they gain more knowledge and life experience, it starts to crystallize in a way that had they not had those experiences as adults, it wouldn't crystallize because they hadn't had that sort of training, if you will. And again, that's not measurable. It's not easily measurable, at least. But it seems to me that if we're not keeping an eye on those kinds of things, we're selling ourselves short. I would actually make the argument that in 1983, Nation at Risk here in the States sort of set us on a path that disincentivized the kind of teaching that might foster some of those skills. Right. And now part of the reason why we're in such a crazy polarized world is that. Not the only reason, but part of that.
And I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I'm also aware that it can very quickly degenerate into a rejection of any evidence,
Agreed.
Because of the quantitative research. But in fact, the good news is that there is quantitative research in this area. There's a very nice study by Carell and West done at the US Air Force Academy. And so over an 8-year period, they looked at what happened to recruits and how they were assigned to calculus instructors. And I don't know if you know this, but the US military randomizes the heck out of everything because they really want to find out what works.
Yeah.
I don't think they have many ethics committees. They just are really focused on finding out what works, because when things work better, people don't die so often.
Right.
So what they did was they looked at the success of these students in their first year calculus courses. And what they were surprised to discover was that students who were assigned to less experienced, less qualified instructors actually did better on their end of course exams. But when they looked at how those same students did on follow-on courses, the students who'd been assigned to the more experienced, more qualified instructors did better. So the less experienced instructors were preparing kids for this year's test, whereas the more experienced instructors were preparing kids for next year's test. And what's really interesting is the students who were asked to evaluate their instructors, the ones who actually got the less effective instruction for the long term, gave their teachers higher ratings. So students gave higher ratings to less effective instruction because it was focused on the short term and the students felt it was meeting their needs, but it wasn't laying good foundations for future learning. So in fact, there is good quantitative evidence that what works in the short term might be unproductive or even counterproductive for the longer term. And I think we always have to look at that. And, we see that all the time in state testing. I live in Florida, and reading and writing are both in our third grade standards, but only reading is tested in third grade. If you're a fourth grade teacher, you hope and pray that the teacher who had your kids last year did some writing, because otherwise you're starting from scratch. The important point is that every teacher builds on the foundations laid by her predecessors, and we can't possibly measure all the things that good teachers develop in their students to actually do this kind of value added. And so I think a bit of humility is required here, that this idea of teachers laying sound foundations for future learning. And there's plenty of evidence of that from the Moving to Opportunities work. We've seen that attending a high quality kindergarten can actually improve high school grades and improve adult earnings. So a lot of these things that really good teachers develop are not manifest for years to come. And so I think we need that kind of research just to remind us how little we know about the long-term impacts of some of these things.
Yeah. One of the other things that strikes me is the difficulty of doing that more abstract, and I just talked with a founding principal of a school in California, Intellectual Virtues Academy, and they really try to teach through intellectual virtues. I love that idea. I had some real questions about, are the kids actually learning knowledge, and how does that work? What kind of kids does it attract, and what kind of kids does it not work for? But we also, I think, have to realize that teaching is hard, number one, and teaching well is really, really hard. And again, depending on what outcomes you're after, if you're saying, well, inquiry or project-based learning, again, I'm an advocate, we help teachers do it, but it's not easy. And it's easy to do really poorly. And if it's done really poorly, it can be disastrous, especially if you're not including actual knowledge in teaching. And so I am somewhat sympathetic to the argument. One of the people I had on my podcast years ago, and I've struck up an acquaintance with her, actually serendipitously was able to get together with her in New York City years ago, Catherine Burbelsing, who I'm guessing you're familiar with, in Michaela in London. And she certainly advocates for something more traditional, and while I think there's probably significant overlap in what we actually think is good teaching, she certainly would lean much more towards the more traditional direct explicit instruction and away from that inquiry. And I think that's probably, like, the idea that she's doing terrible things for kids just seems absurdly silly, even if I don't necessarily agree with all of that approach. But it does resonate, or I'm sympathetic to that argument of saying, well, if we're going to choose between inquiry teaching and or direct and explicit instruction, knowledge building, which I guess I would say is easier to do well. Maybe that's not true, but I would intuitively say that to be true. Then we should, if we're going to have to choose between the two, we should choose for the knowledge building, because if nothing else, those kids come away with that kind of thing. And so I'm curious, does that resonate, or would you frame it differently?
I think the question about knowledge building is what kind of knowledge gets built. So if the knowledge that the students acquire is only any good in passing the exams that are in a pattern they've seen before, then you'll give those kids a good head start in life. They'll get to the colleges they want to get to. But what you skilled them at is something that is of limited usefulness everywhere else. And so there's a kind of discounting effect here, the short term versus the long term. I don't know enough about Michaela, and I don't think anybody does actually, about what's going on there, because we haven't seen what happens to those students 5 years later on. Have they been hothoused just to pass exams, or have they been taught to think? And my hunch is they have been taught to think. So I think it's just a different way of teaching them to think.
I would assume so as well, yeah.
So I think the real issue here is that, I think your insight is correct, that explicit or direct instruction is easier to do well. The trouble with more inquiry-based instruction is keeping the inquiry focused in a productive direction. So let me give you an example from a subject that's called design and technology in the UK. So the idea here is there are basically four aspects of competence. One is defining problems, the first one is actually identifying areas for design and technology thinking, then defining the problem, then solving it, then evaluating the problem. So we did some work in the 1980s and the 90s on rich tasks like hypothermia in the context of old age. So we'd ask these 14-year-olds to think about the issues there, define a problem, solve it, evaluate your solution. And so we had kids talking about, nice warm clothes, looking at the insulating factors for different kinds of clothing. And this group of girls completely deposed the problem. They said, why can't these people afford to heat their homes? So they were given a problem, hypothermia in the context of old age, which we'd imagined would take them down a particular technological route.
Right.
And these girls said, this is, people shouldn't have to choose between eating and heating. And so they took our problem and threw it away and took a step back and addressed a more fundamental issue. The problem then, of course, is they're not going to address any of the content that you think you're going to get there. So in a way, what I see as a fundamental tension in inquiry-based instruction is we pretend to student-focus the activity, but we don't student-focus the assessment. We still try to evaluate it in terms of traditional measures of, say, science achievement. And I think that's the fundamental tension there, that good inquiry-based instruction is perched on a knife edge between giving the students agency, but at the same time constraining the task enough so that their explorations lead to productive learning.
Yeah, and that's exactly what one of the things we stress in our work with teachers is like you want to make sure that you're clear on what you want them, what's that cognitive path you want them to travel, and then how do you keep them on it, at least reasonably so. You might have some forays off of that path here and there, but that can be a real problem with teachers because they go for that behavioral engagement. Oh, they want to do this problem. Oh, that's great, and they're working on it. But wait, you wanted them to think and learn about these things. Now they're thinking and learning about those things, and that could be a real problem. And especially if those are things you're supposed to be accountable for.
Right. So let me wrap that up because this is where I think teachers' subject knowledge is so important. Mm-hmm. So the good teacher can think of a way of nudging or scaffolding the student's inquiry so that they actually move in a direction that's productive because they have this view of the overall subject. The novice teacher often doesn't have enough of an overview of is this good science or not,
right,
to be able to make those. So they just let the students play.
Yep.
And the students have a great time, but they don't acquire the fundamentally important disciplinary knowledge.
Right.
And I think we often underestimate the importance of teachers having an overview of what does it mean to think scientifically? What does it mean to think historically? Mm-hmm. And it seems to be quite hard. I don't know of a single teacher who has this down cold, who has less than 10 years experience. Mm. It's that seeing how the whole field fits together and seeing how I can keep the students moving productively.
Right, and I'll add to that even those experienced teachers with that subject knowledge, if they don't do the planning and design work prior to the students entering the project or unit or whatever, they are building the plane as they're flying it, and the risk of them getting off that cognitive path that they want them to travel on is much, much higher, and that's a real problem as well. Well, I want to wrap up, and I appreciate the time, but I also, so one maybe last question that relates to the formative assessment and something that resonated with me, and if you could unpack it a little bit, because it struck me as something that's similar to something that we do, talk about thinking routines and making thinking visible. And you're talking with Anna on the Chalk and Talk podcast and talking about, your shift from asking students questions as a formative assessment to statements. And I thought that was really interesting, and how you talked about that. So if I could get you to talk about that a little bit as well. But what it really highlights to me is one of the things we try to get from teachers, get teachers to think a little bit more about, and this does relate to that shift from a sort of science of learning, direct explicit instruction approach, in some ways, because, and it's unfair to say this, I'm going to say it, but it's unfair, is that we want to shift from just getting what's in the teacher's head out to the student to also include getting what's in the students' heads out and making it visible for the teacher and for peers as well. Now, when done well, direct and explicit instruction, direct instruction does that, and if you're doing that method well, you're doing that, but that importance and that shift, I think, is really something that teachers maybe don't think about enough. It's, I've got to get this content out to them. I've got to deliver this, and then I'll test it, and I'm sort of getting what's in their head, but I'm not really getting it out. And so we talk about facilitative questions and versions of the question of what makes you say that. And asking students versions of that, which is not the same as statements, but is similar in there. So if you can kind of talk about that a little bit as we wrap up, I'd appreciate it.
There's a framework that I found very helpful, developed by a math education researcher named Brent Davis at the University of Alberta. And he was looking at the changes this is a one teacher research study, but he looked at this teacher's change in practice, and he described it rather nicely as a shift from evaluative to interpretive listening. So the evaluative listening teacher asks a question and is listening for the correct answer. And you can spot that kind of teacher because when the students give an incorrect answer, they say things like, close, almost, nearly, nice try. The interpretive listening teacher tries to use what that student has just said to figure out what can I learn about that student's thinking. So just to clarify it, to the evaluative listening teacher, all incorrect responses are equivalent. It just means they didn't get it yet. To the interpretive listening teacher, wrong answers are interesting. They're different, and they're revealing of students' insights or understandings of a particular topic. And the idea that you actually listen very carefully to the students, not just did they get it right, did they get it wrong, but what can I learn?
Right.
Is I think a crucial shift. And we see that shift taking place in teachers as they get better at formative assessment. That shift from evaluative to interpretive listening. So the precondition for this is that students say stuff. And every teacher knows that when you actually try to engage students, they often say things like, dunno. And that's basically student code for go away and leave me alone. So one of the things that I've stressed in my work with teachers is we just got to get the students talking. And sometimes asking questions is fine. But the point about statements rather than questions, and this is based on the work of James Dylan, the point about making statements rather than asking questions is you can be wrong answering a question. You can't be wrong responding to a statement. And so I try to use this with my work with students and with teachers now. So I often ask a group of teachers, what do you think happened in this experiment? And I ask them to use finger voting, 1 for A, 2 for B, 3 for C, 4 for D. And now I don't say things like, why did you choose A? I say, you thought that A was the most likely response. Just a conversational opener. And often there's an awkward silence that ensues, but I've never got to the point where I needed to say anything else. Eventually the teacher will respond with a justification. And I just think the whole idea of, rather than saying, why do you say that? Shifting from that to, I'm interested in hearing a little more about that. So it's just that shift from the Q&A, that kind of exchange, towards something that resembles a normal human conversation.
Right.
And that, I think, is just crucial, especially where students aren't used to voicing their opinions. And there's lots of things you can do to make that more plausible to the students. One is to say, we can get into cold calling and all the other techniques that people like Dr. Moff have spoken about. But I think the crucial message to send to the students is, you belong in this classroom. You are a full member of this classroom. You all think different things about these issues. I need to hear from all of you in order to make good decisions for this group. And I can't make good decisions unless you share with me what's going on in your head right now.
Right.
And just making that inclusion argument, I think, is crucial to effective pedagogy.
Yeah.
You're right. Most teachers rely on a response from the smartest kid in the room, and that's not a very good sample.
Right. Yeah, and as a wait time, I know you talked about that in the Chalk and Talk podcast as well. And I don't have time. We don't have time to get into it. But one of the things that I use in my work with teachers is to try to extend that, because it is awkward and it's silent. I'll sometimes joke. I'll say, awkward teacher wait time, because we just have to give them time to think, and sometimes that silence is really, really awkward. So, well, Dylan, I really appreciate the time and the conversation. It's been wonderful. You're on the Twitter or the X or whatever they call it at Dylan Wiliam. It's Wiliam, but I'll put that in the show notes. Anything else? Any other place they should find you, or anything else you want to say to the audience before we jump off?
I've shared quite a lot of videos of me talking about stuff on YouTube, so you can actually just go to YouTube and search for me. You'll find loads of videos and PowerPoint slides to accompany those videos. There's a website that's not particularly informative, but there's some stuff there from some papers. But just basically looking at the work I've done recently, just written a book with Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry that's coming out in June about trying to develop these issues in more depth. But it comes down to the point that David Ausubel made 50 years ago. Good instruction starts from where the learner is. Ascertain this and teach accordingly. Basically, find out where your students are before you try to teach them anything. If you start from that assumption, I think you won't go far wrong.
Well, as I said, I appreciate the conversation, and as I always say to folks listening, I hope it was helpful.
It's been fun.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.